The prairie was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that feels like something has been taken. A cold wind blew through the burnt remains of a once lively homestead, carrying with it whispers of laughter that no longer echoed. Just one man sat on the porch, staring at the hills where his wife once picked wildflowers and his little boy chased shadows with a stick. Grief had carved itself deep into his eyes, leaving behind a look that wasn't just sorrow, it was emptiness. And yet, as twilight fell and the land grew colder, something unexpected stirred along the tree line. A barefoot native boy, rail-thin, eyes hollow, barely standing. The boy didn't speak. He didn't beg. He just stood there, trembling, like a ghost unsure if it belonged in the world of the living. The man saw him, but didn't move. For a long time, both remained still, two souls caught in the ruins of what used to be. Then, without a word, the man rose, walked to what little remained of his pantry, and brought out a crust of bread and half a jar of beans. He didn't ask the boy who he was, where he came from, or why he was alone. He simply handed him the food, sat down on the porch, and waited for the night to come. He had every reason to turn that child away. His own son had been taken by fever just weeks before. His wife, too, buried beneath the oak tree, now shedding its final leaves. He hadn't spoken to another soul in days. The land was dry, the winter early, and the grief heavy. But in that moment, something ancient took hold. Not pity, not duty, just a memory of what it means to be human, even when everything in you is broken. He didn't feed the boy because he had plenty. He fed him because he remembered what it felt like to have someone who cared. The boy devoured the food with quiet desperation, as if he feared it might vanish. The man watched without judgment, his heart too worn to feel pride. And as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, painting the sky in bruised oranges and deep purples, something shifted. Not in the world, but in the man. A seed buried under the weight of loss stirred for the first time. Not because something was returned to him, but because he chose to give, even when he had nothing left. This isn't a story about charity. It's not even about survival. It's about a moment, a quiet, ordinary moment, where one broken man gave hope to another without asking for anything in return. In the Old West, where justice often rode faster than mercy, and loss came without warning, this simple act would echo farther than bullets or gold. Because sometimes, it's not the strong who shape the frontier, it's the kind. The following morning, the man found the boy asleep beside the woodpile, curled into himself like a wounded animal. A blanket had somehow slipped around his shoulders. The man couldn't remember placing it, but his hands must have acted in the night, guided by instinct older than thought. For a brief second, the man considered letting the boy go when he woke, sending him off with a canteen and a warning about winter coming in fast. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the way the boy had eaten, not greedily, but with reverence, like each bite meant more than just survival. The boy rose slowly, blinking at the sunlight. His eyes scanned the ranch, wary but not afraid. He didn't speak. He only looked at the man, waiting, not with expectation, but with a strange kind of dignity. The man, still sitting on the porch, nodded toward the empty bucket near the well. No commands, just a gesture. The boy seemed to understand. He picked up the bucket and walked. And just like that, a rhythm began. Not a conversation, but of coexistence. For days, neither of them said much. The man worked in the silence he had long grown used to, mending fences, chopping wood, tending to the single cow that hadn't been sold. The boy followed, never getting in the way but always helping. He brought water, gathered kindling, even fixed the loose hinge on the chicken coop without being asked. The man noticed. He didn't say thank you, but he left a second biscuit on the plate each morning. The boy noticed too. One afternoon, a storm rolled in. Dark clouds moved over the hills like cavalry, and rain fell hard and fast. The man expected the boy to seek shelter in the barn, but instead found him out in the field, covering a row of fragile seedlings the man had almost given up on. Drenched and shivering, the boy worked quickly, hands raw, face streaked with mud. The man ran to him, pulled him toward the porch, and for the first time, raised his voice, not in anger, but in worry. "You'll freeze out there," he said. The boy just nodded, teeth chattering, as if he didn't mind freezing, so long as something lived. That night, They sat by the fire, both wrapped in old quilts. The silence between them was warm now, not empty. The man poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to the boy, who took it with both hands like it was gold. Then the boy spoke, just one word. "Thank you." It was quiet, almost lost in the crackle of the logs, but it landed like thunder in the man's chest. Because it wasn't just gratitude. It was the first brick in something neither of them had dared to rebuild: trust. Winter arrived with sharp teeth, biting through the valley with no mercy. Snow piled up at the door, and the wind howled like spirits looking for a place to rest. Supplies were thin. The man had planned for 1 mouth, not 2, but he never once asked the boy to leave. Instead, they rationed carefully, half portions, long days of boiling thin stew, and longer nights of quiet resilience. Hunger made them tired, but not bitter. Somehow, they both understood that what they had was better than what they'd left behind. The boy began speaking in fragments. A word here, a name there. His voice was soft, as though he hadn't used it in years. The man didn't press for more. He only listened. And when the boy finally said, "They didn't make it," the man nodded slowly, knowing exactly what those 4 words meant. No need to ask who. No need to reopen the wound. Loss, it seemed, was a language both of them spoke fluently, without needing to translate. They spent long hours carving wood together. The man shaped tools. The boy made animals: birds, wool, the buffalo. Each carving was detailed, careful. It was the boy's way of saying the things he didn't have words for yet. One evening, he handed the man a small figure, a woman holding a child. The man froze. His throat tightened, and for a long while, he couldn't speak. He ran his fingers over the smooth edges, then simply placed it on the mantel, above the fire. Neither said a word, but something sacred passed between them. When wolves came prowling near the livestock, it was the boy who heard them first. He shook the man awake, pointed toward the barn, and ran outside without waiting for permission. Together, they lit torches and fired warning shots. The wolves retreated, and in the frozen stillness that followed, the man realized something. This boy was no longer just surviving. He was protecting, fighting, choosing to stay. As they stood side by side in the snow, breath rising in puffs of steam, the man rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of authority. It was acknowledgement. They weren't just sharing space now. They were becoming family, not by blood, but by bond. And in a land as harsh as the frontier, sometimes that kind of family was the only kind that lasted. Spring didn't come with flowers that year. It came with mud and thawed sorrow. The snow melted slow, revealing broken fence posts, waterlogged earth, and memories buried under months of cold. The boy had grown lean but strong, his silence replaced now by steady words and quiet questions. He asked about cattle, about tools, about stars. Never about the past, his or the man's. It was a mutual respect, forged in silence, and now carried in conversation. One morning, while mending a post, the boy paused. "Did you love her?" he asked, not looking up. The man didn't answer right away. He drove a nail into the wood, the sound sharp against the stillness. Then he replied, "With everything I had." The boy nodded, almost to himself. "And your boy?" The man's hand froze on the hammer. A beat passed. He laughed with his whole body. The man said, "And he trusted me to keep him safe." Another pause. I didn't. The wind carried the words away before the man could take them back. The boy placed a hand on the post. "My father left," he said, eyes steady. "He gave me to the missionaries and never came back." For a second, their pain touched like 2 old spirits meeting at a crossroad. Not competing, not comparing, just knowing. The man looked at him, something deep shifting behind his eyes. "But you're still here," he said. The boy smiled. "So are you." That spring, they rebuilt the barn together. Replaced every plank, every hinge, as if laying a new foundation not just for tools and horses, but for life. The boy painted the door red. "So it can't be forgotten," he explained. The man didn't ask what he meant. He just helped apply the second coat. Every stroke was a promise that what had been lost wouldn't be the end, and that the stories buried in the soil would be remembered through the work of their hands. And when the last nail was set and the sun dipped behind the hills, they stood together, watching the barn glow like a beating heart in the dusk. It wasn't grand. It wasn't perfect. But it stood. And in a world that often took more than it gave, standing, together, was everything. Summer brought visitors, drifters, traders, neighbors from miles out who had heard stories about the ranch, where a quiet man lived with a native boy who carved buffalo and built red barns. Some came with kindness. Others came with questions lined with suspicion. "He yours?" one man asked, spitting tobacco into the dust. The rancher didn't answer right away. Then, staring the man dead in the eye, he replied, "He's with me." That was all he said, and it was enough. But not all who came were curious. One afternoon, 3 riders approached, men who had once served with the rancher in a war no one wanted to remember. They came not to visit, but to remind him of what they thought the world should be. One of them looked at the boy, his voice dripping with contempt. "You feeding strays now?" The rancher didn't speak. He just stepped forward, placing himself between the boy and the insult. "I'm feeding my kin," he said. The confrontation passed without violence, but the message hung in the air. The world beyond the ranch hadn't changed. It still judged, still feared what it didn't understand. But inside those fences, something rare had grown, a bond unbought and unbroken. That night, the boys sat by the fire, whittling another figure, this time of a man and child side by side. He handed it to the rancher without a word. The rancher placed it next to the woman and child on the mantel, where the flames could reach it gently. In the months that followed, the boy began calling the man Pa, not loudly, not ceremoniously. It began with small things. "Pa, the fence needs patching." "Pa, supper's ready." And each time, the man answered, not with surprise, but with a quiet peace that comes when something long empty is finally filled. No one asked for that title. No one needed to. It had grown, the way wildflowers do, unseen at first, then suddenly everywhere. They harvested that summer together, beans, corn, squash, enough to get by, and a little extra to share. And as they sat on the porch, watching the land they'd mended bloom again, the man turned to the boy and said, "You know, I think this place needed you more than you needed it." The boy didn't reply. He just leaned back in the old wooden chair, nodded at the horizon, and whispered, "Maybe we both did." As the days grew shorter and the air began to cool once again, the ranch settled into its rhythm. Chores done with quiet purpose, meals shared under fading light, and laughter that came more easily now. The boy had found not just shelter, but purpose. He no longer hesitated when speaking, no longer flinched when the wind howled through the night. The man had changed too. The lines on his face remained, but the weight in his shoulders had lifted, even if only a little. Together, they had transformed sorrow into something sacred, routine, grounded, real. One morning, while out repairing a broken fence along the far ridge, they came across a small burial mound, likely Apache, long forgotten by settlers who had pushed through decades earlier. The boy knelt beside it, brushing the dust away with reverence. The man watched silently, knowing instinctively not to interrupt. After a moment, the boy whispered something in a language the man didn't recognize. It sounded like a prayer, or perhaps a song. And in that quiet, sunlit moment, the past and present met without needing permission. The boy rose and turned to the man. He was probably alone too, he said softly. The man nodded. Not anymore. That evening, they built a small wooden marker for the grave. Not for recognition, not for ceremony, but because every soul deserves to be remembered. The boy carved a small coyote into the wood. "He'll find his way," he said. The man simply placed a rock beside it, the same way he'd once marked his wife's resting place, years before. Word of the grave spread through the region, and not long after, an elder from the boy's original tribe visited the ranch. He was slow-moving, weathered like driftwood, but his eyes were sharp. He didn't speak much, but when he saw the boy, taller now, confident, he smiled. They exchanged only a few words in their native tongue, but it was enough to bring tears to the elder's eyes. "He remembers," he told the rancher later, "not just who he is, but what he carries." The elder left a small woven pouch with the boy, filled with herbs, bone beads, and a feather. "To remind you," he said, "that kindness is the oldest tradition we have." And as the man and boy stood on the porch that night, watching the last colors fade from the sky, the rancher looked down at the feather in the boy's hand and said, "You were never astray." You were always meant to find your way here." The boy didn't answer. He just reached for the man's weathered hand and held it tight, as if he'd never let go. The harvest brought both reward and exhaustion. They filled barrels with grain, stacked wood high, and stored jars of dried meat for the winter ahead. The ranch was no longer just surviving. It was thriving in the quiet way only honest land does. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now brought gifts. Extra flour, wool blankets, a pair of mules retired from a nearby farm. "Heard your boy's strong," one man said. "Thought he could use these." The rancher didn't correct him. He only smiled. "He sure is." One evening, the boy brought home a stray dog, thin as a shadow and covered in thorns. "He followed me," the boy said. The man chuckled. "You sure you didn't lead him?" They cleaned the dog, fed it scraps, and named him Ghost. Not because he haunted, but because he stayed quiet and watched, just like the boy once had. And as the seasons turned again, Ghost became another thread in the family they were stitching together. No ceremony, no declarations, just love in motion. With winter on the horizon, they sat by the fire more often. The boy read now, old books the man's wife had once collected. He read aloud, slowly, sounding out the words while the man carved by the hearth. One night, after finishing a chapter, the boy asked, "Did you ever think you'd have this again?" The man looked up. "No," he said, "but I think maybe it was never about having again. Maybe it was about learning to hold what's in front of you, even if it looks nothing like what you lost." The boy thought about that for a long moment. "You think they'd be proud?" he asked quietly. The man didn't need to ask who. "I think they'd be at peace," he said, knowing this land still holds something good. They didn't cry. Not anymore. The pain hadn't vanished, but it had been given a place, a room inside the house of their new life, where it didn't have to be hidden, where it could simply rest. That winter came heavy, but it didn't feel cruel. Snow fell in thick, quiet waves, and the house glowed from within, not from fire alone, but from a life rebuilt without permission, without blueprint. Just two souls who had once been lost, who had once thought they had nothing left, and who, through nothing more than one small act of kindness, had found their way back to the world and to each other. Midwinter brought a silence different from grief, the kind that blankets the land in stillness and makes every sound feel sacred. The snow piled high, but the house was warm. The boy now rose before the sun, stoked the fire, and had water boiling before the rancher even swung his legs out of bed. The man would sometimes sit at the edge of his bunk, staring at the steam curling from the pot, remembering a time when mornings meant nothing but survival. Now they meant legacy, a rhythm handed down not by blood, but by bond. One particularly cold morning, they found a letter nailed to the fence post. No signature, just a rough warning carved into the wood grain. "You don't belong with him." The boy's hands clenched, not in fear, but in anger. The man read it, sighed, and threw into the fire. "Hate always comes from those who've never known what it's like to be loved," he said. The boy didn't reply, but later that evening, he wrote out and fixed every weak post on the fence line. Not out of fear, but as a statement. We're still here. The attacks never came, but the tension did. Some townsfolk kept their distance. Others leaned in with awkward kindness. It didn't matter. The man and the boy lived like trees, roots deep, branches stretched. They didn't flinch when wind blew. Instead, they kept building. A new chicken coop, a second stall in the barn, and a small shed for drying herbs and pelts. The boy had begun trapping, trading furs for coffee, nails, and flour. "You've got a good head for barter," the rancher said once. "Better than I ever did." The boy beamed for hours. One snowy evening, the boy came in holding an old photo frame he'd found buried in the barn. The glass was cracked, but the image behind it, the rancher's wife holding their child, was still clear. He handed it over, unsure if it would wound or heal. The man took it gently, ran a thumb over the faded faces, then set it beside the wooden figures on the mantel. "They were my past," he said softly, then looked at the boy. "You're mine now." Later that night, as snowflakes danced outside the windows, the boy sat by the fire with Ghost curled at his feet, reading aloud from a battered book. The man listened with his eyes closed, each word filling a room once emptied by loss. The ranch, the family, the life, none of it had come easy. But in the quiet of that storm-wrapped night, one truth was clear. Sometimes, the greatest gift isn't what the world gives you. It's what you choose to give back, even when you have nothing left. Spring came again, this time earlier, warmer, almost as if the land itself had begun to soften. Birds returned, rabbits darted through the brush, and the creek behind the barn overflowed with snowmelt. The boy planted rows of beans with methodical care, lining the furrows with string, just like the rancher had shown him. Straight lines make strong roots, the man had said. And that spring, every line seemed to take a green promise sprouting for brown soil. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the ridge, not a threat this time, but a young schoolteacher from the settlement 10 miles east. She had heard of the boy and the ranch, and came asking if he'd be allowed to attend the one-room schoolhouse. He's more than earned his place, the rancher said. The boy hesitated, unsure. Books were strange, death stranger. But he looked at the man and saw not pressure, just pride. So he nodded. I'll try. That first day, the boy left early, hair combed, shirt tucked, Ghost trailing behind until the fence. The man watched him ride off, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the ache of quiet again. Not the old kind that devoured, but the kind that whispered, "Look how far he's come." The boy returned at sunset, dusty, exhausted, but smiling. They didn't laugh, he said. And I answered 2 questions right. The man ruffled his hair. Next time, make it 3. The ranch grew busier with the season. Traders brought word of the boy. How polite he was, how quickly he learned, how he helped clean up after lessons without being asked. The townspeople began to change too, just a little. Prejudices faded slowly, but undeniably. They didn't just see a native boy on a white man's ranch anymore. They saw a young man shaping something of his own. And that made them pause, reflect. Some even brought extra seed packets or old tools with no strings attached. That spring, under a sky blooming with stars, the boy and the rancher stood at the edge of their land, side by side. The past behind them, the soil rich beneath them, and the road ahead wide open. They didn't need to speak. Their silence had long since transformed from grief into belonging. And in that quiet, the West didn't feel like a wild place anymore. It felt like home. A home built not by blood, but by choice. Not by luck, but by love. By the time summer stretched across the land like a golden blanket, the ranch had become something unrecognizable to those who had first doubted it. There were new hens in the coop, a clothesline that snapped in the breeze, and laughter that rang out from the porch as the boy read jokes from an old newspaper. The garden bloomed in full, and behind the house, 2 more graves had been marked, not out of sorrow, but out of reverence. One for the forgotten soul on the ridge, the other for Ghost, who had passed quietly, loyal until the end. The boy buried him beneath the tree where he used to read, carving a stone himself. He watched over us, the boy said, voice thick with emotion. Now we watch over him. The man said nothing, only stood beside him, hat in hand, heart full. They didn't speak of Ghost much after that, but every morning, the boy left a bit of bread near the grave, just in case. One day, while patching a section of the southern fence, the man paused and leaned on his hammer. "You've grown tall," he said. The boy smirked. "You've just shrunk." They both laughed, and it was the kind that echoed out, startling the crows and drawing smiles from the trees. It was a sound that had not graced the ranch in years. A sound once stolen by tragedy, now returned by healing. They began taking in strays. Not just animals, but people. A woman fleeing a violent home. A quiet boy who had lost his parents in a flood. A wounded drifter who offered to chop wood in exchange for bread and stayed for 3 months. The ranch became a way station for the weary, not a place of charity, but of shared work, shared meals, shared peace. It wasn't advertised, but word traveled. Some called it the quiet place, others Red Door Ranch. But those who left always said the same thing. Something lives there that the world forgot. The man and the boy never asked for thanks. They only taught others what they had taught each other. That healing takes time, and trust is earned through presence, not promises. And in each new hand that joined the work, in each new story shared by the fire, the legacy of that first act, that moment when a grieving man gave food to a starving boy, continued to ripple outward, shaping lives in ways neither of them could have ever imagined. Years passed, and the valley changed with them. Trees grew taller, trails faded and were replaced by new ones, and the seasons turned with steady rhythm. The boy became a man, broad-shouldered, wise-eyed, and known across the land as someone worth listening to. The rancher grew slower, but not weaker. His hands still held strength, though his voice came softer now, filled with more pauses, more reflection. The bond between them only deepened, no longer just father and son by choice, but partners in purpose. One crisp autumn morning, the rancher sat in his chair overlooking the fields and said, "You remember that first night you came?" The young man nodded. "I remember being too scared to speak." The rancher smiled. "And yet, you said thank you." A silence followed, the kind that doesn't need filling. Just the two of them, watching what they had built from nothing but grief, wood, and grace. Eventually, the day came when the old man didn't rise. He lay peacefully in his bed, the same one where he had once wept himself to sleep after losing his family. The young man sat beside him, holding his hand until the final breath passed like wind through the curtains. No last words were needed. Everything had already been said, through years of work, sacrifice, protection, and quiet love. He buried him beneath the oak tree, beside the wooden figures and stones that told the story of a life salvaged from silence. The ranch lived on, not as a monument, but as a heartbeat. The young man took in more hands, more stories, more people needing what he had once received, a place to start again. He told the tale of the man who had nothing left, yet still chose to give, of the cold night, the shared meal, and the porch where kindness took root. And every time he told it, someone cried, not because it was sad, but because it reminded them that even in the hardest places, compassion can still rise. And so the West, with all its dust and cruelty and history carved in hardship, carried within it this small truth, that sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is give when he has nothing left. That feeding a starving boy in the middle of heartbreak might just be the act that rewrites the future. And that in the end, legacy isn't built on land or gold, but on hands that lift others up, one quiet moment at a time. In the dust and silence of the Old West, where most stories are written in loss and hardened hands, one man's quiet decision became the seed of something greater than even he could imagine. He didn't raise a gun or carve his name in a stone. He simply gave when he had every reason to keep. And in that moment, he reminded us that the truest acts of courage don't roar. They whisper. They offer a hand. They choose love, even when grief threatens to swallow everything whole. What began with a single meal shared between a broken rancher and a starving boy became a legacy, not of blood, but of choice. A life rebuilt through small, steady kindnesses. A family formed by presence, not inheritance. And a home defined not by its walls, but by what it welcomed: pain, healing, memory, and above all, hope. The ranch didn't grow rich in gold, but it overflowed in something far rarer, the kind of wealth that can only be earned by giving when no one is watching. This story isn't about a hero rescuing someone. It's about two wounded souls choosing to stand, to stay, and to build. It's about what happens when one human being sees another and says, "You matter," not because of what you bring, but because you exist. And in a world that often moves too fast to notice the forgotten, that simple act becomes revolutionary. Because sometimes saving someone else is how we end up saving ourselves. So now, I ask you, what are you holding on to that could change someone else's life? A gesture, a word, a place at your table. Maybe, like that rancher, you've known deep loss. Or maybe, like that boy, you wandered too long without a hand to hold. Whatever your story, let this one remind you. It only takes one moment, one small act of grace to begin again. If this story reached something in your heart, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so these stories can keep finding their way to those who need them most. Leave a comment below. Share what touched you, what stayed with you, or who you'll think of next time someone reaches for help. And if you believe kindness still matters, give this video a like, not for the numbers, but for the message. Because in a world that forgets too easily, we choose to remember.